Jack, the Brown University War Costs website has an all-in 9/11 cost of $6.4 trillion. Are we going to have to budget for this debacle, or is there like a debacle budget already in place?
There's more or less a debacle budget in place, at least for the early stages of this. There is sort of an outstanding question as to how many refugees are going to be coming to the U.S. The president mentioned pretty vaguely yesterday he would be looking to help Afghans at risk. There's not a number that he provided. So the executive branch could unilaterally get and announce they were going to get another $500 million to help refugees. The question is if they're going to need more than that, and if Congress is going to have to act, and if this is going to get tied into the whole legislative agenda, and if it'll be slow moving. And really, that's more of a question of the efficacy of the U.S. efforts to help people rather than the cost.
What is your reporting on the Pentagon in the last 48 hours?
On the costs they need, in the initial stages, it appears they have what they need. There hasn't been a request to Congress yet, but you could probably tell by watching the president's speech yesterday, this is evolving pretty quickly, and it's not entirely clear what comes next. But in terms of the cost and the ability to send those additional 6,000 troops, they more or less seem to have what they need for now. The question is, in a few days or later, are they going to need more from Congress?
Jack, what's the political debate around discussing and negotiating directly with the Taliban, especially now as they really do take control of the nation?
Well, we had a preview of that debate, or the start of the debate, when the peace agreement was negotiated directly between the U.S. and the Taliban that kind of precipitated all of this, that did not include directly the Afghan government at the time. There's an interesting split in Washington in which Democrats and some more libertarian types are more or less happy about the general idea of pulling out of Afghanistan, and we're willing to view those discussions with the Taliban as they happened last year. Obviously, today's events, the events of the last few days, put that in a very negative light, and there's a lot of sort of neoconservative criticism coming, although it's more focused on the details of how this pullout have gone wrong rather than specifically with the idea of the U.S. Going into talks with the Taliban, which obviously had already happened to a significant extent.
Jack, how much has this debacle, and I'm talking about the humanitarian issues and the deaths that have arisen as a result of how quickly the government fell to the Taliban in Afghanistan, how much has that taken oxygen out of the room when it comes to discussing infrastructure and other economic and, frankly, health policies that President Biden has been trying to push through?
It's a strange time for this to happen because the Congress is in recess and they're kind of working behind the scenes on everything they need to do to put their infrastructure bill forward and all of that. Obviously, this is dominating the news cycle, and it's possible this will require attention from Congress, especially if they do need to appropriate more money and come up with a more specific plan for refugees. But really, they can do both at once. It's just a very difficult political issue. Probably the greater risk is just the frustration that is building and any ill will that may occur in bipartisan conversations.
Jack, an unfair question, and it goes back to MacArthur. It goes back to a Midwest isolationism that was there after various and sundry wars. How isolationist right now is your Washington?
Significantly more isolationist than when I was growing up, obviously, and when the U.S. got into the war in Afghanistan. It's worth keeping in mind this is now two consecutive administrations from different parties that laid out a plan to pull out of Afghanistan. And even as President Biden's speech didn't really address the facts and the issues in the short term on the ground now, his emphasis on the long-term strategy of the U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan, his emphasis that the U.S. shouldn't be engaged wholeheartedly in nation building, and emphasis on the limits of what the U.S. should have tried to accomplish in Afghanistan, really has some bipartisan appeal. It's not as big in the Republican Party as the Democratic Party, but this is a continuation of what we've seen now for two administrations, not necessarily isolationist, but definitely pulling back on the outward focus in foreign policy, at least in terms of the military, that we saw for a long time.
Jack, we've got to leave it there.